El jefe will see you now. Come with me. El jefe.
I got the money. You got the weapons?
If you want to talk to him, you talk to me.
Oh, you're the translator.
Ah, tú eres el traductor.
No, tú eres el traductor.
No, you are the translator.
Okay? I got the money.
Yo tengo el... Ay, perdón.
No te escuché, tosiste.
I didn't hear you, you coughed.
No, I didn't. I didn't cough. You coughed.
No, yo no tosí, tú tosiste.
Deja de decir que yo tosí.
Stop saying that I coughed.
You coughed when you spoke to El Jefe.
Tú tosiste cuando hablaste con el jefe.
¿De qué estás hablando, traductor?
Ah, translator, what are you talking about?
Can I, try talking to him alone?
¿Puedo hablar con él a solas?
Sí, yo me voy.
Yes, I will go.
What? No. No. Hey, I meant us.
Ah, ¿se refiere a nosotros?
¿Sí ven acá?
Yes, come here.
Espera, pensé que querías hablar conmigo solo.
Wait, I thought you wanted to talk to me alone.
Yeah, exactly.
Sí, exactamente.
Entonces ven acá.
Then come here.
So that's, I think, a good example of how things can really go off the rails with this kind of a video. And what we want to do today is talk to you about how to keep things on the rails and how to do our best to work with the courts and understand the role of the court interpreter. So with that being said, it is my great pleasure to introduce our learning objectives. And so we're going to be going through our information on how to collaborate with interpreters, how to communicate, address common challenges, and also cultural and emotional appropriateness. Judge Bershon is going to cover the legal aspects of interpretation, and they're both going to cover tips and tricks. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce Marisol Ramirez, who's a certified court interpreter, a Spanish language interpreter with the Los Angeles Superior Courts. And we're very grateful to have you here today with us and for sharing your experience. So please take it away, Ms. Ramirez. And you are on mute.
Thank you for that. Hello, everybody. I'm very excited to be here today to be able to sort of talk about what court interpreting is like from my side of the legal system. So before I say anything else, I just wanted to sort of make a little point. There's the words translator and interpreter are used interchangeably oftentimes. I hear it constantly, but I think it's important to note that there is a difference. Translators refers to people that convert what is being said in one language into another through the written word. So they have the benefit of time, they have the benefit of research, they have the benefit of editing before they present the actual written translation. An interpreter is someone that does the same thing, that converts one language into another in real time through spoken word. So that clip that you saw, I'm not sure if that's from Funny or Die or one of those shows, but they keep referring to the gentleman as the translator, the translator, the translator. And I think in general life, people do throw that word around, but it's important to note that when people are converting one language into another orally, verbally, that is an interpreter. So during that whole clip, I kept sort of like, it was kind of like, it was just sort of becoming very apparent how often that the incorrect terminology is used. Anyway, having said that, so I wanted to sort of talk about what court interpreting is. So like I said before, it's the conversion of one spoken language into another in real time so that the litigants or the parties that are involved in the legal proceedings can understand fully what is happening and can participate fully in their own judicial proceedings. And like I said before, there's a little note there about the difference between translation and interpretation. So court interpreting is really, really important, especially in the state of California, because this is such a multicultural state. We have people from all over the globe that have moved here, come here, and there are so many languages, even just in Los Angeles alone, so many languages that are spoken. So court interpreters weren't always provided in court, in family law, or even in criminal proceedings in the state of California. So before 1974, court interpreters could be provided and sometimes were provided, but it wasn't a constitutional right. After 1974, California voters amended the actual state constitution to include the right to a court interpreter. So now it is mandatory. It's not something that's optional, which is great. And we could go to the next slide, please. So also the importance of the court interpreter, I just want to state, is that having a court interpreter, or I guess the point or the goal of this sort of class, talking about court interpreting, is to sort of give everybody an overview about why it's so important, what it is, and how we can all work together, court staff, anybody in the legal proceedings, along with the court interpreters, so that the litigants, the parties, can fully participate and feel secure and have agency over their own proceedings. Okay, so how does it work? How does it actually play out? So as far as the logistics are concerned, a regular day at court, I'm at Stanley Mosque right now, which is a civil courthouse, family law matters. So a person will show up in the courtroom and request an interpreter for their given language. I personally interpret in Spanish and English. So let's say somebody would be brought in. At that point, the judicial assistant will put in a call to the office, and interpreters will be sent to the different courtrooms. At that point, the interpreter comes into the courtroom and they talk to the judicial assistant and sometimes the bailiff, but most of the time it's the judicial assistant. And at that point, the judicial assistant will give the court interpreter the information that they need for the matter. So it will be the case number, the names of the parties involved, the litigants, the names of the attorneys, and what type of proceeding it is. It could be a trial, a mediation matter, it could be a hearing, etc. At that point, the interpreter sets up what we call setup, which is you approach the people that you will be assisting, and you introduce yourself. And a lot of the times here at Family Court, because we interpret for more than one person on any given day, we use sometimes we can have microphones or little headsets that we distribute among the litigants so that we can speak sort of in a hushed tone into the microphone, interpret as the judge is interpreting, so that two voices aren't competing with one another. And that way it sort of makes it a little bit clearer. And because the litigants will be wearing headsets, they can adjust the volume and hear the proceedings in a way that is clear to them. And they're not struggling to sort of hear amongst combating voices. So that will happen. The equipment will be distributed. The parties will sit down. Not everyone uses equipment. Sometimes if interpreters don't, they will stand next to the parties or right behind and speak into their ear. And then at that point, you're sort of off to the races. The proceedings begin, the judge begins, the attorneys begin to speak, and it is the court interpreter will begin to interpret the moment the proceedings begin. So everything that is being said is interpreted by the interpreter. Everything that is being said by the judicial assistants when they swear in the parties, the attorneys, the judges, the litigants. Sometimes there's witness statements and more than one interpreter will be called in. And then you're off to the races, like I said. I liken it to be sort of like a giant telephone. So you are receiving the information and you are putting forth the information into through a different language. However, that is without any kind of omissions, additions. There, you cannot summarize. So for instance, if a person says, that day I crossed the street, then you have to interpret that day I crossed the street, so that the court reporter can take it down as the person said it. We are not to summarize and simply say, oh, that day I crossed the street. So no omissions, no adding anything, even if you feel like that addition will make the statement seem a little bit more logical or make more sense. The interpretation must be as accurate and precise as possible, including, like I said, hesitations, repetitions, if somebody stops and starts, that all has to be interpreted for the record. If we could have the next slide, please. Okay, so once the matter is concluded, then the interpreter's job has finished. At that point, you pick up your equipment and you are to leave the courtroom. It is important to remember that an interpreter serves as a neutral language conduit and not an advocate, and therefore must remain impartial. And what I mean by this is that oftentimes, because litigants don't speak English and oftentimes are overwhelmed by the proceedings, they are listening to legal terminology that they've never heard. Sometimes their education level is such that this can be very overwhelming to them. And so oftentimes they will ask the interpreter, the person that speaks the same language that they do, for advice, for clarification. It is important to remain completely impartial at that moment, in a very professional way, sort of redirect them to somebody else and say, you need to ask your attorney that. If they don't have an attorney, then one would say, you need to ask the judicial assistant. I'm sorry, I cannot help you. And then at that point, the interpreter exits the proceedings. We could have the next slide, please. Okay, so why does court interpreting matter so much? So Los Angeles handles one of the largest volumes of family law cases in the country. I believe Stanley Mosque is the biggest family law civil courthouse in the country. And also Los Angeles is a very linguistically diverse. It's one of the most linguistically diverse court systems in the United States, with thousands of limited English proficiency litigants each year. So clear communication is essential in order to provide equal access to justice. And court interpreting also protects and ensures due process. So litigants can understand everything that is being said in court. They can express themselves. They can participate meaningfully in their matters, in their cases, which is really the goal. If we could have the next slide, please. Okay, so the code of ethics. So interpreters have to follow a code of ethics, just like all the other officers of the court. Interpreters, like I said, must remain completely neutral. And that includes not just not giving advice or clarification, but also sort of in your demeanor, in your tone, the way you approach somebody. You are to approach everybody with the same sort of respect and neutral respect, I would call it, as you would a judge or an attorney. You must keep the information completely confidential. You are not to speak or comment with a fellow coworker in the elevator or in the hallway about what you just saw or what you just heard or your opinion on it. It's kind of like what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. What happens in the courtroom stays in the courtroom. And like I said before, you must not give legal advice. We're not attorneys, and that is not our job. And it's very easy to feel compassion and empathy for people that are in really tough situations, but we cannot provide any kind of explanation or clarification. If they have questions, we must direct them to somebody else, somebody who can answer those questions for them. And of course, we have to report conflict of interest. So if a court interpreter shows up in a hearing and one of the parties is their neighbor or their neighbor's cousin, or you know them, or you've worked with them before. At that point, you have to inform the judicial assistant. They will call a different interpreter, and then you will be sent to assist in a different matter somewhere else. And if we could have the next slide, please. Okay, challenges. So there are a lot of challenges, and as a court interpreter, there are very emotionally charged matters. There's a lot of really difficult stories to listen to, stories of abuse, of abandonment, neglect, in cases of domestic violence. There's a lot of emotional testimony. People will become emotional. And it is very important to focus on the task at hand in order to help that person to your maximum capacity. So if people break down and you feel like you are connecting or you're getting too emotional, it's really important to just keep your mind on putting forth the message of what they are trying to put forth, to interpret, to help them through their proceedings and help them participate to their fullest capacity. Now, there are a lot of cultural nuances. Even in Latin America, there's so many different countries, and even though it's sort of, we all speak Spanish, there's a lot of different slang, there's different cultural aspects, also depending on someone's age, generation, things can vary a lot. And so oftentimes it's not just about interpreting words, it's about conveying the meaning accurately and in the context of both the language and the culture. For example, for example, well, here's an example. Today I had a lady who spoke a dialect from, I think, Oaxaca, and her Spanish wasn't it wasn't really like a native speaker's sort of Spanish as far as the level is concerned. And so she had trouble conveying whether or not she was able to serve a notice to somebody else. And she kept saying, yes, I did, when in fact she had not. So for instance, and this is a sort of a similar example, yes might not always mean an agreement. It could just be an acknowledgement of having understood what is being asked of them, or simply being polite. So there's a lot of sort of cultural nuances and linguistic nuances that can occur in one day. When they do, it is the interpreter's job to ask the judge for clarification. So and for an example of that is, I would stop the proceeding and say, excuse me, Your Honor, may I ask for clarification? The judge at that point most likely would say yes. And then I would turn to the party and say, what do you mean by that? Or can you repeat that? Can you explain what you mean? And then once I obtain the precise meaning of what they're trying to say, then I would interpret it to the judge. Also, another challenge are self-represented litigants. A lot of the times they're nervous, they're overwhelmed, they don't know exactly how to ask the right questions, how to respond, how to sort of fill out the right paperwork. In that case, that's also another challenge, like I said before, is they will ask the Spanish speaker, which is the interpreter, for help. Again, they must be redirected, and someone else must give advice to them. If I could have the next slide, please. Oh, on a couple other challenges, like I said, there are terms without exact equivalent. So some things are lost in translation, quite literally. There are things that cannot be translated or interpreted. At that point, you must find the meaning of what they're trying to convey and just convey that. And like I said before, slang, which is constantly changing. You can see it in English as well. The slang from the 80s or 90s is totally different than the slang that kids are using now. Idiomatic expressions from different countries might mean the same thing, but might be worded differently. And idiomatic expressions from different generations as well. So these are just some of the challenges that you sort of have to learn to handle on a day-to-day basis. Modes of interpretation. Okay, so there's different ways of interpreting in the courthouse here through the legal system. Simultaneous is the mode that is used most in hearings, during trials. The parties will normally wear a headset, and the interpreter will be interpreting in real time at the same time as the judge speaks, as the attorneys speak. That changes a little when there is a witness. When there's a witness, then we switch oftentimes to consecutive mode. So the attorney will ask a person that's on the witness stand something, and when they respond, you write down, you take notes of what they say. Once they're finished, you offer that rendition out loud so that the court interpreter and the court reporter and everyone else can hear it. And so consecutive is used mostly for witnesses. Simultaneous is used with everything else for the most part. Sight translation isn't something that is used all the time. Once in a while it shows up, and that is when someone hands you a document, a legal document that you've never seen before, and you kind of have to interpret it, sight unseen, in real time at that moment. And then there's remote interpretation, which is occurring more and more. A lot of times parties are in another state, in another country. That happens a lot during Hague trials when there are people in other countries. We've done some with people in Venezuela, people in Colombia. And also sometimes when people just can't make it to court because of their situation, they can phone in and sort of appear remotely through the court system, which is called Court Connect, or sometimes even through WhatsApp or the WhatsApp video. And if I can have the next slide, please. Okay, training. How do you become a court interpreter? So people think that just because someone is bilingual or they speak Spanish at home with their parents and their families, and they speak English at school and the rest of their lives, they can interpret at court, and that is not the case. In order to become a certified court interpreter, you must be certified, which means you must pass a written and oral certification exam, which is laden with legal terminology, ethical standards, and you have to be able to perform real-time interpreting at a fast speed. In order to do this, people normally train. There are various programs throughout Los Angeles County and throughout really the United States that you can take now. Usually it takes about 2 years to really study and prepare yourself before you take this exam. Once you pass the exam and you're registered through the Judicial Council, you can begin working. And also as a court interpreter, you have to take continuing education classes all the time. Working effectively with interpreters. So this is, I think, very important as an interpreter who has to work with other people on a day-to-day basis. One of the most important things, if not the most important, is that parties should speak clearly and at a moderate pace. Oftentimes, and I see it with young attorneys especially, their natural cadence is sort of a very fast cadence, and when that happens, they speak a mile a minute, and it's really hard to keep up. So in order for the parties, which are really the ones that matter, that's why we're here, in order for them to really understand so they can participate in their matters, it's important for everyone to speak slowly, or at least not slowly, but at a moderate pace and clearly. It's important to project and to articulate. I've always said I think attorneys should take acting classes, and they should take voice and speech, because it's just crucial. It is crucial. When this doesn't happen, the interpreter at that point will ask the judge to stop. So for instance, if an attorney is just flying through their speech, the interpreter would say, I'm sorry, Your Honor, could you ask the attorney to slow down? I can't keep up. And then the judge would most likely ask the attorney to slow down, or ask anyone who is racing through what they're saying to slow down. It's important to use plain English when possible. I think simple is always best. Just the meaning that you're trying to convey. I want, I need, can you tell me this, when, where, how, what? Also, it's important to pause and allow time for the interpreter to finish interpreting what they're saying without interruption. Also, interruptions are really hard on the court reporters because they're trying to write everything down. So that's really something that's very important. Avoid interruptions, like I said. And this is my personal pet peeve, and I've heard other interpreters talk about it. Just abstain from unnecessary remarks like jokes and waxing poetic. There are a couple of, I've been in a couple of hearings where people like to make jokes or comparisons. And like I said, not everything is, things are lost in translation. And I think not only does it distract from the objective, which is trying to litigate a case, but it also creates more work, not just for the interpreter, but also for the court reporter. And also it kind of, it takes the litigants off balance because they're sort of focused in trying to understand these proceedings. They're not attorneys. They don't know legalese. And so when they're so focused on that, and then a couple of jokes come their way, which they don't understand, it just sort of breaks down the streamline of what is being tried to accomplish. Okay. All right, takeaways. So professional interpreting safeguards everyone involved and helps ensure that the legal system functions fairly for everyone involved. I believe, and I'm not the only one, but I think interpreters play a vital role in promoting fairness, maintaining accurate records, supporting meaningful participation, and improving outcomes for families. And then just on a personal level, I'd like to say that I can't tell you how fulfilling it is to be able to sort of be that conduit for people and families and people that are scared, that are overwhelmed. They're in really tough situations. And I feel like if they have someone where they feel that they are being heard and their voice is actually being given a stage, it's a moment of triumph, not just for the legal system or for the proceedings, but also for the person as a human being. It's sort of like, I think Carl Jung talked about a state of grace, where when someone is present and is being heard, and understands that they're being heard and they're given that agency, it's sort of, it gives them grace. It gives everyone involved grace. And that's one of my favorite aspects of the job. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Marisol.
Thanks.
It's so wonderful to learn from your experience, and especially we're grateful that it's you out there giving these litigants a chance at humanity in these proceedings. So without further ado, I would love to introduce Judge Bershan, who sits in Stanley Moss Department 2C. And without any further ado, Judge Bershan, please take it away.
Thank you so much. I'm going to speak clearly. I may not speak at a moderate pace because I have a lot of slides to get through. I want to thank the Harry Buhey Center and your amazing executive director, Stacy Horth Newbert, who I've known for almost 20 years when we were both about 15. She's amazing. Thank you, Karen, for including me, and thank you, Marisol. Okay, so when we talk, the rules of court define people who need interpreters, and they call them limited English proficient. Describes a person who speaks English less than very well and who as a result cannot understand or participate in a court proceeding. Why do I start with that? Because I've been a judge for 12 years and a commissioner for 2 before that. And there have been times where the other part, especially if you're waiting for an interpreter, the other party said, Your Honor, they don't need an interpreter, or they speak English fine, they talk to me. Most judges, most bench officers are going to take it from the litigant, whether or not they feel they need an interpreter. I mean, it's one thing to converse in a second language with casual conversation. It's another thing to really understand the legal concepts, the complexities, things that are going on in court proceedings. So and I know a lot of my colleagues are going to err on the side of caution. If somebody, was speaking English beautifully before, but then they say they need an interpreter, we're really going to defer to them. That's not really our decision necessarily to make. If they indicate they can't speak English that well, we want to make sure and Marisol talked about due process. It's important to due process that they understand what's going on. Next slide, please. All right, and again, the government code recognizes and the legislature recognizes that increasingly in California, we're a very diverse, multicultural society, and in order to provide equal justice under the law, that we need to provide interpreters. And so not only do we provide interpreters, but the Judicial Council has a whole system. The Judicial Council, for those of you who don't know, is the umbrella organization that oversees all courts in the state of California. They're the administrative body for the courts, and they have a whole training, hiring, regulation program for interpreters. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, this is the legislature announcing the importance, the need for equal access to justice and due process, that we carry out this shared goal that people who need interpreters have interpreters. Then here's the caveat. In criminal cases, no issue. In civil cases, they understand that we have limited funds, and there may be times where we can't necessarily provide interpreters all the time. So Evidence Code Section 756, which will be our next slide, sets out a priority when there's a limitation the amount of interpreters. It's a prioritization of which cases get priority first. Next slide, please. Okay, so basically the first group of priority, you're always going to have an interpreter for a domestic violence proceedings, for issues regarding a protective order, civil harassment cases involving violence, threats, or stalking, allegations of elder and dependent adult abuse with physical abuse or neglect. Those will all take priority. Then if there's still enough interpreters, obviously unlawful detainer actions. Next slide. And the next slide is in more detail. So the priorities again laid out in 756, it's going to be domestic violence restraining orders and elder abuse matters, civil harassment restraining orders, then unlawful detainers. And look at this, unlawful detainer proceedings get priority over proceedings to terminate parental rights. Interesting. Next, conservatorship proceedings, custody proceedings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Why do I lay that out? Because the reality is, and Marisol can also speak to that, right now, especially in mosque, we do have a shortage of court interpreters. And so when it comes to that, there is going to be the triage of what's going to go first. And if you have a proceeding that involves, a modification to visitation, and the interpreter is needed in another court with a domestic violence restraining order proceeding, that's going to take priority. Next slide, please. And just so everybody knows, and Marisol talked about this, the interpreters, in addition, will be trained and having certification requirements and training and ethics. They take an oath too, that they take an oath that they will make a true interpretation of the language that the witness understands, and that they will truly interpret all of the questions and the statements that's required by the evidence code. Next slide, please. And I just show this because this is both in criminal and civil jury instructions, though we don't necessarily use jury instructions in family code proceedings. This is applicable. I mean, just so you know that if there is a difference, some people are native language speakers and they hear an interpreter making an interpretation. They're like, I didn't agree with that judge. They didn't interpret correctly. The presumption is that the trier of fact has to rely on the translation provided by the official interpreter, even if somebody else understands the language differently. Now, there's a separate issue. In the event that, some bench officer or someone feels that there's been a consistent poor interpretation, that's obviously something they can take up with management on a separate level offline. But there is a duty of the trier of fact to abide by the official interpretation. Next slide, please. Okay, and I know Marisol went over this, but I want you to know it's in the rules of court. These are the requirements for the professional conduct for interpreters, and I really want to highlight E, giving legal advice. and Marisol said it, they're not supposed to do it and they don't do it. But why do we stress this? And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more at the end. Those attorneys in the audience, I really want you to think about, situations, especially if both parties are remote, that's one thing. But if you're remote and your client's in the courtroom and they have a question and you're not there, they're going to look to the interpreter. And I've seen this all the time for legal advice, for guidance. And Marisol has mentioned this. They ethically cannot do that. And so I just think about, that's something I just would hope that attorneys think about when they're going to put their client in a situation where they're not either right next to them somehow or other, or there's a huge distance and their clients don't understand what's going on, especially if you haven't prepared them before. They're going to look around and they're going to look to the interpreter because that's a person right next to them, and the interpreter cannot give them legal advice. So I just want, and we're gonna revisit this at the very end, but I want you to think about that when you think about preparing for a proceeding. When you have a client that's going to need an interpreter, are you going to be with them? Are you going to be with them in the same room when you're appearing remotely? That's one thing. But if one of you's remote and one of you's in court, it sets up this situation where they may be looking around and who's going to help me here, and the interpreter is not the person to help them. All right, next slide, please. Okay, I learned something new recently in doing this. So there are only officially 12 designated current languages, and as of 2024, the Judicial Council removed Japanese, Western Armenian, and there was another language from their official certification languages, and they reduced them to registration language. What does that mean? So there's these 12 officially certified languages, and they're laid out here. And then there's other languages which are what they call registered language. I think the difference is in how they create the lists of available interpreters and how they're trained and how they're certified. So you see interpreters of spoken languages for which there is no state certifying examination are required at least to pass an English fluency examination and fulfill Judicial Council requirements, but they don't get on a certified list. And this is important for the next couple slides, and I'll tell you why. Next slide, please. So the government code section lays out and it codifies that the Judicial Council develops procedures and standards for certifying interpreters and registering interpreters. So if you have a certified or a registered interpreter, that they've been vetted. One of the reasons why my understanding is they reduced certain language to registered interpreters because apparently there wasn't either as much of a demand or as much of a pool of available applicants. I remember I was in Torrance for many years and we had a number of Japanese speakers in Torrance, and I was told there was only, I think, one official certified Japanese interpreter for the entire county of Los Angeles, and he doesn't drive. I think he takes the bus or he took Uber. So it makes it difficult sometimes when you have those cases in with those languages, and you're gonna see at the end where I make a recommendation. I'll make it here again. For anything other than Spanish, though, I think some of our other courts, they may have on-site Armenian interpreters, and I think Cantonese interpreters in certain courts, but you can assume there will be an on-site, at least one, if not multiple, Spanish interpreter at most courthouses. But if you have an interpreter for a language, especially one that's in sort of a registered language, whether it's, Japanese or Cambodian or something like that, you need to plan in advance. You need to tell the judicial assistant and anticipate. If you know the hearing's coming up soon, you get on that phone, call the clerk, let them know I'm going to need this interpreter on this day. Or if you have one court appearance and you're going to have a continued, you let the court know, Madam Clerk, Sir Clerk, we're going to need this same interpreter 2 weeks from now, because if you haven't given them advance notice, you're most likely not going to get an on-demand interpreter for a language probably other than Spanish, with a few other exceptions. Next slide, please. All right, again, the rules of court just like this, very formal about how a certified or registered court appointed interpreter is appointed by the Judicial Council, and you note, for those of you who've been in court, you note, like I will say to the interpreter, please state your credentials on the record, and they say I'm a certified or registered interpreter in this language, their number, I've been verified. That has to go in the record every single time. And so most interpreters are really good. If the judge forgets, they'll just say it and they'll remind you, because it's part, I think it's in their DNA. They know to do that. I see Marisol shaking her head. All right, next slide, please. All right, again, there will be situations where either an available Spanish or Eastern Armenian or Italian interpreter is not available, one who's been certified by the Judicial Council, or a registered court reporter is not, interpreter is not available, or it's a language of something other than an either certified language or a registered language. There is the ability to allow somebody who's not either certified or registered to interpret. They have to fill out a form. I tried to scan it. It's the interpreter form 110, and it's a 4-page. It's very detailed. It talks about all of their various, where they've been qualified, their proficiency exams, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They file it with the clerk, and your clerks will know how to go through this. They can be provisionally qualified or certified. So there's a procedure to do that in the event you can't get either a registered or a certified interpreter. And I believe all of these government code sections and statutes are in your material. So I'm not going to go to too much detail in these. You all are lawyers. You can read statutes. Next slide, please. Again, what the court will have to say on the record, that after a diligent search, a certified or registered interpreter is not available. And then in that case, as long as the 110 has been filled out and signed, the court makes that a court order, and they can provisionally qualify someone who's either not certified or is interpreting in an uncommon language for the courts. Next slide, please. All right. So I sped through so I could get to the important, all of the meat. Okay. Right now, Spanish interpreters are currently in short supply in Mosque. I don't really know why. I don't know if it's a recruiting issue or a attrition issue. I've seen some emails back and forth with some colleagues that waited sometimes until 3 o'clock, which is awful. It's not good to get interpreters. It's not good, and I know the court is working on it. Why do I say that? You or your client may be waiting some time right now until an interpreter is available. As soon as an interpreter walks into my court, I stop everything, and most judges will. We drop everything to take the interpreter matters. We do. We just do. So we do give priorities. I've been a judge for a long time. There have been times where I have walked into other courtrooms and I see, whether it's the Spanish or the Russian or some interpreter just sitting there for hours and they haven't been called. And sometimes, I mean, you can't Monday morning quarterback your colleagues, but occasionally like, well, is there, why is the interpreter there? And because it's known that if you have an interpreter matter, you handle that case right away to get them on their way to another court. I say all this because there may be, and look, your clients have a right to be there, and I understand, but there may be an appearance that's just a continuance, a real procedural, or something that you've spoken with your client offline, a trial setting, something like that, where you don't need it's not essential for your client to be there. Just think about, I'm not saying don't bring them. I'm just saying, think about that, because it's very possible you might be waiting for a long time. And sometimes if I see a client and an attorney and a client waiting a long time for an interpreter, I may ask the parties, can you appear on behalf of your client? Does your client need to be here? Does your client need to hear real time what's going on? And sometimes they'll say, no, I'll waive their appearance. Even though they're there, they'll waive their appearance for purposes of them being on the record, and then they'll explain to them offline afterwards what happens. Again, if you require a non-Spanish interpreter, especially on one of, if it's Italian, German, Arabic, Russian, something like that, please let the clerk know in sufficient advance time prior to the next court proceeding. And even if there's some question, you think, oh, well, maybe my client speaks well enough, and then all of a sudden your client gets there and says, no, I want an interpreter, especially in some of these languages, it's going to take a week, sometimes longer, and so you'll wind up just continuing the matter. Okay. I'm going to say this again. The interpreter is not a lawyer. I can't tell you how many cases I've had where the clients are in court The attorney is remote. The clients have no idea what's going on, and they're looking to the interpreter for advice, and they can't give them advice. And the clerk's busy, and the clerk doesn't give advice, and certainly not the judge. So please think about it. I know it's sometimes it can be very convenient. I'm not saying don't participate in remote proceedings. Maybe you and the client are both remotely working, and that's fine. And sometimes I see with litigious matters, the clients are in one room in the attorney's office and the attorney's in the other room, but still they can communicate. By the same token, if you told your client to be there at 8:30 in the morning and you don't show up until 10:30, again, they may be looking to the interpreter. And the other thing, I'm just going to say it, it is what it is. I'm not saying, do you want your client waiting in the courthouse for hours before your case is called? Just throwing that out, something to think about. Okay. Especially if you get there early, and in a perfect world, if the interpreter's there, you have time to talk to the interpreter. If you can allow the interpreter to converse briefly, I said LEP, limited English proficiency person, to ensure that if there's a dialect issue or understandings or pronunciation differences, in a perfect world, that will happen. I'm not sure we have the luxury of it happening, but hope springs eternal. If there are documents or things or terms or information or things that are going to be of a major focus of the hearing, it might be helpful to just have a conversation to show those documents to the interpreter, so at least they can familiarize themselves beforehand. However, as Maricel mentioned, the interpreters are not translators. It is not their job to translate a 5-page deed or something in Spanish into English. Why do I say that? If you have documents that are going to be essential to your case that are in another language, you should probably have those translated for the bench officer before you come to court. Again, it's not the interpreter's job to go through these voluminous documents and translate those into English. I have seen them, and I don't know if Maricel will correct me if I'm wrong, if there's the occasional text message or something like that. I don't know if Maricel wants to unmute herself, or she can to.
Yes. Yes.
Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. That is correct. In fact, in like even today, there was a lady wanted to present some text messages as evidence, but they were in Spanish. They hadn't been translated into English, so that can't be accepted. And then oftentimes, like you said, somebody will show up with a deed or whatever and say, like, can you just go over this with my client? And, we don't know the law, so when that happens, what we will do is normally we'll have the attorney say, well, can you review it and I will interpret what you say. So I will interpret you, but you have to review it with her. I can't do it for you because I'm not a lawyer.
Right. So it's not their job. So if you have documents in another language, you should really get them translated officially if possible. And there are ways to do that. It is not the interpreter's role. Please, it should go without saying. I'm surprised that I have to say it, but I do have to say it because it happens frequently. Please prepare your client before the hearing, especially if you've had them prepare a declaration that has then been translated into translated into English. There have been times where I will ask parties about statements they've made in their declaration, and they look at me like I'm from another planet. They have no idea what I'm talking about. And sometimes they go so far as contradicting exactly what's in the declaration. And it makes it even harder. This often happens when the party is in the court room and the attorney is remote. And in that case, what I do, I just say, counsel, we're going to take a break and we're going to come back, and you probably need to speak to your client, or we'll continue it. So please, I know it should go without saying, but I have to keep saying it. Please prepare your client before the hearing. Have a conversation. Tell them what to expect. Tell them what kind of questions are going to be asked during the hearing. Prepare them, especially if you're not going to be with them right next to them holding their hand because the interpreter cannot give them legal advice. Next slide, please. Okay. Again, I'm going to just piggyback on some of the things that Marisol said. Especially if your clients are appearing remotely, instruct them to speak loudly, clearly, and one at a time. It is, I don't know how many of you have been in a busy courtroom, but it always happens this way. You have maybe three people in the courtroom, then you have some attorneys online, you have an interpreter, and then of course you have people in the audience who just decide that's the time to have the loud conversation with the bailiff. And all this stuff is happening at once. I'm a bit of a taskmaster in my courtroom. I tell people stop talking, especially if there's interpretation going on. But please, and if you have a court reporter too, one at a time, wait till everyone's done. A part of preparing your clients includes understanding what objections mean, that there need to be a break, that you have to wait for the judge to rule. But by the same token, speak directly to the person who's requiring the interpretation, not the interpreter. It's always amazing to me why attorneys feel the need to show off their SAT words and their very complex vocabulary in an interpretation matter, especially when the trier of fact, which is in family law matters, is me. I'm a judge. You don't need to impress me with your big fancy multi-syllabic words, especially in an interpretation case, because it's that much harder. So don't say, we always use this in criminal law. They say, don't say exit the vehicle, say get out of the car. Keep it simple. To Marisol's point, don't make jokes. I can't tell you how many times I've had an attorney asking a witness like a super compound question, and then the witness answers yes. It's just, so keep it simple. It helps with your record. It makes it easier for the interpreter, and it just ensures that you're most likely getting accurate responses to your questions. Again, and to Marisol's point, the interpreter is not charged with explaining anything the party said. So what I've seen, I'm sure Marisol does, is the interpreter will ask me, especially if they don't understand, they'll say, "May I inquire, Your Honor?" And I always say yes. And then they clarify with the witness if there's something they didn't understand, and then they'll come back. But it's not the interpreter. The interpreter's not a lawyer. It is not their job to explain anything. I talk really fast. Court reporter don't love me. Court reporter, clerk. But if you have one of these hearings, and especially in family law, they're very emotional and people are going really fast and they want to be heard. That's a lot for an interpreter. And so plan when you're planning your hearing and your time. Oh, Your Honor, it's only going to take half a day. Is it half a day on a regular day when you're not interpreting, or is it half a day where there's a lot of emotion and interpreters and they need breaks and you may need two interpreters? And especially if you have an interpreter for a witness and an interpreter for a party. So build that into your time estimates, just like you have to give court reporters breaks, interpreters need breaks. And Marisol raised this again too, checking in with the person needing the interpreter to make sure they understand. And don't just say, do you understand, yes or no? Try and elicit, what color was the sky or whatever. Try and ask a question that elicits a substantive answer so you can ensure they're actually understanding. And again, if the interpretation is consecutive, make sure before you ask your next question, make sure that the interpreter has finished interpreting before you answer your next question. Most interpreters, and I'm sure Marisol does this, are good. They will tell you, hold on, can you hold on? I love interpreters and court reporters who are very frank and slow down, Your Honor. Can you ask the party to slow down? I can't understand. I want to hear that because I want to know if something's going wrong and we need to slow down, that I need to make adjustments. And I do want to, Marisol mentioned this too, in terms of jargon and understanding. I'll give you a story, a real life story that actually happened that hopefully puts this in place. I had a case once in criminal law, and it involved whether or not the spousal privilege applied. And for those of you know, a spouse can't testify against another spouse; it can't be compelled. And they kept the parties kept referring to, mi esposo, mi esposa, spouse in Spanish. And we went all the way through, and it turned out they actually weren't legally married, which is required in order to invoke the spousal privilege. But in their culturally, they had lived together as basically common law spouse. They had lived together as common law husband and wife for 20 years. So when they kept saying, this is my spouse, everybody assumed they were legally married. And it wasn't until the very end we realized that the spousal privilege does not apply because they're not legally married. That's just a clear example of, you want to make sure everybody understands the language, what you're talking about. Don't make assumptions. Make sure it's very clear. We're running out of time, and we're on the last slide, and I will speak clearly, but maybe not moderately. Okay. Final consideration, remote appearances. Please, especially if you're going to be in court and your client's going to be remote, verify that they understand how to work the computer, how they know how to mute. Know that most likely what's going to happen is the interpreter is going to call them on their cell phone. So make sure their cell phone is on ring and isn't going directly to voicemail, which happens frequently. Prepare them for what's going to happen. Make sure they know how to log on, how to put the camera longwise or shortwise, how to mute when necessary. Make sure they can hear you. Make sure they're hearing what's going on. Again, make sure they have a separate working cell phone to speak to the interpreter. And they know to answer the phone. I can't tell you how many times the interpreter, and they're like, Your Honor, it keeps going to voicemail. Your Honor, it keeps going to voicemail. Okay. And instruct them, like if you're not remote or you're not in the same place, how to notify you if nothing's working, if the remote technology is not working. Again, if you're going to appear remotely, plan for the worst. I'm just going to say our systems go down a lot. People can't hear. They sometimes can't log on. They don't know how to put on their camera. If it's a very important hearing, if it's a domestic violence hearing, if you have witnesses ready, make sure you've prepared your clients how to log on, how to turn their camera on, all of those kinds of things. Again, please go over your declarations with your clients. I can't stress that enough. And finally, even though I didn't do it, please slow down. Don't talk over each other, especially in remote proceedings, because there's a delay. And I literally will sometimes have to say, can you stop talking? Can you stop talking? And I literally sometimes have to raise my voice because they keep going because there's a delay. And the worst scenario is you have 3 different remote people appearing remotely. People are talking all at the same time. The interpreter's trying to interpret, and you got a court reporter. So slow down, wait for the interpretation to finish, and wait for questions to be asked and witnesses to answer. And I think that's it. That's all I have.
Thank you so much, Your Honor. Thank you so much to Ms. Ramirez. And that concludes the substantive portion of our presentation. Our panelists have graciously offered to answer any questions if any of you have any questions. So you can feel free to raise your hand or put your question in the chat if you have any questions. And one thought that came to mind when you were giving your presentation, Judge Bershon, is that there is a mechanism to request the interpreter online. And so for the languages that are not Spanish, it is the proper procedure to submit your interpreter request through the link online through the LA court website, and then the clerk gets it. When I call the clerk, they tell me, do it online, please.
Thank you for that. See, I never get involved from that end, so I don't know. So thank you for that clarification. I appreciate it.
Of course. And then while we're waiting to see if anyone has any questions, maybe you explained everything perfectly and there just aren't questions. But while we wait to see if any questions come up, I thought it was very interesting that there's a mechanism to have people interpret who are not necessarily certified or registered interpreters. And I wonder, Your Honor, have you had to do that in your courtroom?
Yes, several times, different languages. I think one time I had it, and we didn't get into it with the sort of the relay interpretation. So it was a Quiche dialect. So it's Quiche into Spanish, and then Spanish into English. And I think the Quiche interpretation was provisionally certified. I've had it a few times with, I think Russian maybe, and Japanese. So yes, I have.
And I had a case this year with Bengali as the language, and that's where I learned the difference between registered and certified. Well, I'm not seeing any questions from the audience, so I suppose both of you just, explained every corner of this topic. So again, we're truly grateful to have both of you here to give us your time and your thoughts today. And do you have any final comments before we sign off?
I just want to thank Marisol and all of her colleagues. I know how hard it is, especially with judges like me who have busy calendars and decide that the way to resolve that is just to speak faster. So please continue to remind us to slow down because it's a good reminder for us and for everybody else.
Will do. Thank you. But I don't think you speak that fast, honestly.
I've gotten better. I've
Okay.
many years of being told to slow down. I'm working on it. Oh, we did. You know what? I do see there's a question in
It's
the
a comment.
Q&A.
There's a
Oh,
comment.
there's just a
It's from
comment. Okay, sorry.
Attorney Mueller, and she says, I don't have any questions, but thank you so much. That was great.
Well, thank you all, and thank you for including me. Appreciate it.
Likewise. Thank you, everybody.
Well, thanks to everyone for your participation, and we hope to have you involved with us in the future, Ms. Ramirez and Judge Bershon.
Absolutely.
Thank
My
you all.
pleasure. Thank you.
Are you